If you were to break down trust into its three primary parts, or the three legs of the stool of trust, what we know from the research is that there are three primary building blocks. Leadership is about disappointing somebody's paradigm at a rate in which they can handle. Because what you're doing, you are upsetting the paradigm of the status quo. It is amazing how life-giving and trust-building an organization that is committed to getting very, very focused on what matters most, it's like rocket fuel for that workplace culture.
Trust is broken. We don't need trust anymore. Everybody's making money. Governments are doing well. Politicians are getting elected. Judges, the judicial system, everything's working great. Cory Sheer, you know a little bit about trust. It's a commodity, isn't it? Nobody needs it anymore.
Well, based on the behaviors of many organizations, many leaders, and many ways of doing business, you are exactly right. Those behaviors are matching exactly what you just stated.
When you look at the public opinion, nobody trusts anybody anymore. We don't trust the news. We don't trust the media. We don't trust the government. We don't trust our bosses. We don't trust big corporations. When we're talking about accountants, professional services, it came down quite low on a list of trustworthy occupations recently, almost near realtors and estate agents, and they're not known for their trustworthy status. So what is going on, Cory? Let's start with the definition of trust. What exactly is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of research that has been, a lot of conversation that has been had around the concept of trust, but a lot of people think about trust as something that is more theoretical or philosophical, maybe ethereal. It is critical that we begin with a common definition. And the one that I prefer to use is that trust is the firm belief in the truth of something. And so what happens, I think, where we begin to see some of these gaps in trust is if we are operating within a team or a company or a corporation or an organization with different versions of the truth, that's where it becomes much more difficult to actually believe all of those different versions of the truth, which is why focus, a plan, accountability, all of those core fundamental elements of business are so vital in order to, number one, define what the truth is, and then continue to support that truth with your systems and processes and accountability. And so if we start to fray from the actual truth and we operate with a different version of the truth, then our faith in that truth or our firm belief in that truth becomes less and less. And that's unfortunately the dynamic that we're seeing at scale right now across all industries.
Why is trust being eroded, Cory? Why is it a diminishing concept?
I think one of the challenges that we are all facing societally right now is with COVID, coming out of COVID, 2 years now, really past the heat of COVID and all of the challenges of that. We all really did experience a collective trauma, and we experienced a collective trauma in lots of different ways. Some of us experienced it very personally, some of it experienced vocationally. And in America alone, a third of the workforce left their jobs in 2022, the Great Resignation. And just imagine that. Imagine any other time where a third of the workforce during a calendar year ups and leaves their organization. And so now the effect of that is you have that a third of the workforce that maybe they're back into a different kind of a job. Maybe they're not working. Maybe they're going from a hybrid work environment to an in-person or vice versa. These are all very, very disruptive elements that affect greatly our individual understanding and perception of the truth within our companies. So if there's not an intentional effort in order to understand what it is that we now need to be thinking about, what is our truth moving forward in light of that collective trauma, in light of economic challenges and realities, all of that, then of course it's going to be very, very difficult. I would also say one other thing, with the emergence of incredible technology that is amazing on so many levels, of course, if you look at some of the data regarding AI and just even the trust in what AI is going to bring, we have serious evolutionary changing dynamics that are occurring within everyone's reality, and we take those realities, we interact with them at work, and that creates a lot of dynamics. And so the conditions are such that There are a lot of opportunities for trust to be broken, but there are also a lot of opportunities for trust to be strengthened as well. And that's the goal. That's the hope.
Well, we'll come on to that. I'm just thinking divorce is at an all-time high. Family breakdown is at an all-time high. Relationship cohesion is at an all-time low. And that speaks to trust, doesn't it? Talk to us about some of the manifestations of low trust. What happens when it isn't there?
Yeah, great question. We tend to think about trust not necessarily as a standalone KPI. We tend to think about trust as something that is part of the culture of the organization, which that's true. But it is possible to measure trust as a standalone KPI. But what we typically feel, the KPIs that we currently feel, things like employee retention, the employee time to hire, the employee loyalty. Are they loyal to the organization because they trust the organization, or are they loyal to the organization because they want to collect a paycheck? Those are two different versions of loyalty. We see it in terms of people's work ethic. In our research, what we found is as employees trust their leaders less and less, they literally admit to becoming lazier in their work. And so that lack of productivity creates dynamics that are anxiety inducing. It creates higher levels of tension within the workplace, more stress and pressure, which of course that affects people comprehensively, not just in their work environment as well. But those are a few of the main things that we see. We also, the last thing I would share is that we see a significant drop in the willingness to advocate for or promote that company to somebody else, whether it's a customer, a client, or even a fellow worker or staff member, or even somebody that could potentially be interested in working for that company. Our advocacy goes down as our trust goes down.
Well, our audience here are accountants, and they're often called a trusted advisor because accounting and finance is the language of business, and they are put on that pedestal. Generally, rightly so. It's well earned. They know the business intimately. They have a great relationship, usually with the business owner or the person. But there
Yes.
is evidence to suggest that perhaps throughout the pandemic, some accountants didn't serve their business clients as well as they should have done. They weren't as proactive as they could have been. They hunkered down and went into their shell a little bit. They've been a little bit too attached to the bread and butter of compliance and let's get the legal stuff done. But the advice that's needed, shoulder to cry on, the strategic consulting type advice has perhaps been a little bit absent. So that would speak to trust, wouldn't it? And the way clients feel about their suppliers and advisors.
Absolutely. And if I could, I'll kind of pivot into, we talked about the definition of trust, but maybe it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the structural components of trust, what the
Yes.
data, the empirical evidence shows. Like if you were to break down trust into its three primary parts or primary ingredients, or as it were, the three legs of the stool of trust, what we know from the research is that there are three primary building blocks. The first one is competency. Now, we know what competency is, especially in the world of accounting. There are very specific competencies, technical competencies that are required for an accountant to be really good at what they do.
Yep.
But in addition to those technical competencies, which I would call the resume competencies, there's also things like time management as a part of the competency. Project management is a competency. Leadership is a competency. Risk management is a competency. These are all elements that I would call kind of the elements of a competency, of a holistic competency assessment. So it's not just, are they good at what they do? It's also, are they good at managing their time, risk, their leadership, project management, those types of things. That's one of the building blocks of trust. The second building block of trust is problem solving. And with problem solving, what we find is that it's not just about the process of problem solving, it's also about identifying the right problem to solve. If employees in the organization do not feel like the leaders are identifying the right problems to solve, that is a significant breach of trust for them. That's the number one way that trust is breached, is when there is not the right problem identification. So that's very, very critical. And then the third building block of trust, which is typically within a corporate context, what we see as being the weakest building block is the building block of care for others. And this building block of care for others are things like sympathy and empathy, actively listening to people, demonstrating the care for the whole person. And so it's these three building blocks in combination that ultimately will make an individual more trustworthy. if we have somebody in the organization, especially if they're the leader of the organization, where they're highly competent, they're a fierce problem solver, but they don't have at all any care for others, what people feel is a lack of trust. And when they feel that lack of trust, the leader may justify that they're doing all that they should be doing because of their competence in problem solving, but everybody else is feeling a third of the effect that is really countering what the leader thinks they are being as trustworthy, but the rest of the organization is saying, this person's a jerk. I don't want to work with them. I don't care how good at they are at what their job is or what they do. And so as a result of that, now you start creating this gap and this tension. And these are the things that create a very difficult workplace culture.
How does a boss, a manager, a leader show that they care beyond what I'm paying you, Cory?
It's very simple, actually, but it's very, very challenging. The number one way to demonstrate care for others from our research is to listen actively. It's not pizza party Fridays. It's not, swag. It's not, cookies in the mailbox, employee parking spots. It's none of that. None of that shows up on the data. The number one way that costs absolutely no money, it just costs the currency of time, is to listen actively, to listen with intent. It doesn't mean catering to every request that every employee has. It doesn't mean being overly transparent or oversharing. It simply means having a posture of listening. So slowing down long enough, creating a systematic way to create listening sessions within the organization is the very best first step that you can take in order to start strengthening that building block of care for others.
Just thinking about what active listening means. I'm a former high school math teacher, so I'm taught on pedagogy and how people learn and how they're motivated. So I get that. Accountants are technically super smart and brilliant people. They perhaps lack a little bit with the empathy and skills like that, but they are coachable, we know. The typical conversation to show that you care, from what I'm aware of, goes like this. Cory, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. How's the job going? It's going great. Brilliant. Let me know if there's anything you want to talk about and anything I can help with. Goodbye.
Yep,
Now, that's not active listening, but it's also not active probing and active questioning. And
that's
often
correct.
people don't want to reveal too much. So just break that down a little bit for us
Yep.
on how that could be better.
Great question and great comments. What I have found in the work that I do in my executive coaching, my consultative work, I think the number one question to open up some real authentic conversation is, hey, Rob, number one, I hope you're doing well, but I just wanted to grab a few minutes and I'd love to get your thoughts on this question. And the question is, what are some of the current concerns that you have right now with the work that we're doing? So it's not, did you hear about this? Do you think that we're toxic? It's, are there any? And if there are, what are some of the concerns that you have? That word concern is a very, very powerful word. It's just edgy enough to where it invites people in. It's not a scary word, but it does give people permission to start having a more authentic, deeper conversation. So that's been probably the most effective question that I ask when I start to open up active listening sessions.
It's a great question. I'm just thinking of the British persona is that we don't like to rock the boat. We stand in queues very obediently. And a classic situation is when you're in a restaurant and your steak's too tough or you don't like your meal, and then your waiter comes up and says, how's everything going with your meal? And in Britain, we tend to say, oh, everything's great, even though it's not, because we don't want to upset people. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want conflict or confrontation. So when a boss asks you any concerns, you might be rocking the boat there saying, well, actually, now that you mention it, I've got a list of 25 here that I want to go through with you. Does
And
that admit
that,
weakness, vulnerability? You can't cope with the job on your part? There's a lot wrapped up in that.
well, and that's a great point, but that's the necessary vulnerability that is really critical. I think one of the strategies, though, is you can constrain that conversation appropriately. So it could be something like this. Hey, what I'd love to do is I'd like to take the next 10 minutes to just have a conversation around your top two concerns right now. So you're kind of pulling in a little bit of an intentional constraint. It's not just a complaint session where we're ushering people into a house of pain for the next 5 hours. I think, it's one of my favorite definitions of leadership is that leadership is about disappointing somebody's paradigm at a rate in which they can handle. And so as a leader, it's important that we create the proper rate of change, the rate of conversation where it's not just tell me everything right now that is concerning to you. I think it's let's create a measured conversation, a little bit more of a budgeted change, so to speak, as we think about these. Because what you're doing when you're asking that kind of a question, you are upsetting the paradigm of the status quo. That's really what you're doing. And I think that there is a really important balance between, and I've heard this stated, that management is about preserving the status quo or the déjà vu. We've experienced it before. Leadership is about creating the vujade of we're moving into a realm that we've never fully experienced, but we're going to do this with confidence. It's the combination of déjà vu and vujade that we must have for healthy, flourishing organizations. But that requires pointed, measured questions regarding challenging the status quo.
One of the ways that would get me to open up as an employee to a boss is to know that that boss had my back and to know their intentions for asking a question like that,
Yes.
where it wouldn't be to trip me up, but it would be genuinely to move me forward. So talk to us a little bit about intention and motive in developing trust, Cory.
Really, really good question. I think that's where, one of the really critical supplements to that conversation is if you have not established some shared commitments, some people
Right.
might call that ground rules. The ground rules terminology, I prefer more of shared commitments. And it's not even about the boss saying, this is my expectation of you. That's actually kind of a loaded phrase. But if we say, before we have the conversation around concerns, let's talk a little bit about some of our shared commitments. So, number one, I'm going to follow up with you. If I don't know the answer to a question, I will follow up with you within the week to try to provide clarity. Number two, whatever we talk about here, as long as it's not something that is illegal or that is providing, a huge amount of risk to the organization, I do want to make sure that this feels like a safe space for you. And so that's my commitment to you in that regard. But number three, another shared commitment is I may not be able to solve all of your concerns today, but I'm fully willing and I'm fully present to be able to listen to those concerns. So those are just a few ways of you're almost setting the stage for the best possible conversation, no matter what the concern is.
And this applies not just to in company relationships, but relationship with clients, stakeholders, shareholders,
Absolutely.
everybody. Trust is required there.
Absolutely. And I've heard it said, a good friend of mine named Kurt Bartolich, who I did some co-authoring of data with research with him, he talks about how the brand of a company is built from the inside out. And in the same way, that's what trust does too. Our customers, they will feel the residual effect of a high trust company in the same way that our customers will feel the residual of a low trust company. It has to start internally, it has to start at the top, and it has to start with us individually before we can expect it to be propagated out throughout the organization.
Can a brand be trusted? We're talking here about people and individuals, but you can lose faith or trust in a brand, in a company, can't you?
Absolutely. The brand is the customer is who holds the brand in their mind. That the perception that I have of a company, that is my version of their brand. But all of the things that influence that perception, if those things are not trustworthy, it is going to have a dramatic effect on my loyalty to that company. Absolutely. In fact, there is a very simple equation that is, I think, a brilliant one that some researchers came up with about 20 years ago. It talks about it's trust first, then we focus on value creation. That will then lead to stronger loyalty. So trust, then value, then loyalty.
Yeah. Talk to us about the hybrid world that we live in now. It's easy for me to build trust with you if I'm having a coffee with you or the water cooler, or I'm seeing you every day. We're going out for lunch at work, but people are working from home. They're in the offices on different days. It's really hard to drive culture and trust in, say, an accounting firm if people are not around.
It's very hard. Trust is by nature, it is relational. It is something that we have to have human to human contact in order for trust to be cultivated and strengthened. It can be done virtually, so that's not impossible. It is more challenging, I think. It also requires, in more of a virtual or a hybrid context, it requires more and more clarity and focus on what is it that we are measuring from an accountability standpoint? What is it that we are doing from an activity standpoint? How are we communicating with each other? how are we measuring success in this new version of our work world? That commitment to that level of clarity is even more critical in a hybrid context because you don't pick up on the nuances or the nonverbals or the proximity that you would in more of a face-to-face context. So you have to be that much more focused on ensuring that you're highly sensitive to any problems that might be emerging in a hybrid context. And that comes through the form of communication, through listening, through identifying the right problems. All of the components of the structure of trust are applicable in a hybrid version of our workplace versus as well as an in-person version.
Does it help me trust you more, Cory, if I like you? I can think of people I like, but I don't trust. And I can also think of people that I trust, but I don't like.
Absolutely. That's where when you think about those individuals, that's where you can utilize those three building blocks to do a bit of a more specific assessment because you may feel incredibly cared for by somebody else and they treat you well, they're empathetic, they're sympathetic, they're genuine about you, but they may not be very competent at their job and they may not be a very good problem solver. So you may not trust them in certain areas of your work environment, but as an individual, you feel liked by them and cared for. And so this is where it becomes challenging because if you have a company that is full of people who are really, really kind, really supportive, but they're not very good at their job, then you don't fully trust them. And it's because you only are trusting one of their building blocks of trust, not the other two. So you're exactly right. That dynamic can and it does often happen within a workplace. So on the other side, as opposed to just saying, I don't trust that person, we need to be more specific. What building block or which building blocks are we specifically referring to? Otherwise, that's not ultimately fair to that employee from a developmental standpoint.
All right, we'll get you back on another show to talk about, we've hit the people side of it here, but the policies, the practices, the things that the company could be doing as a whole. But just leave us for this episode with a few things that the professionals listening can do to be more trusted by more people more quickly.
You know, one of the, I would call it the fruit of trust that I see over and over and over with the clients that I work with. I am finding more and more that a lack of focus on what matters most is one of the key fruits of distrust. It is amazing how life-giving and trust-building an organization that is committed to getting very, very focused on what matters most, it's like rocket fuel for that workplace culture. If you simply ask each other, what are the things that we are working on right now? How are we measuring its success? And how do we ensure that we keep things moving in the right direction with sameness in terms of what we're focused on? The other thing I would share briefly is instead of going from an annual construct of success or even a month-to-month construct of success, I'm finding a lot of energy around this whole concept of how do we win the week? If we took our year and broke it up into 52 weeks, if we could win, so let me ask you, Rob, if you won the next 48 out of 52 weeks, would you consider that a good year?
Yeah.
It'd be a great year. So I wonder why not operate in that way with that construct? How do we create conversations that are more weekly in nature, not just meeting with people, but actually focusing on our activity, focusing on what matters most, ensuring that we're doing some pulse check assessments on how are we doing with this particular areas of focus, and then how do we ensure that we create that culture of accountability and focus and trust weekly, not just for the month in report or the annual report. So that's been something that's been very, very practical and very helpful with the clients that I work with.
Cory Sheer, author of Closing the Trust Gap. That's been tremendous. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob.